Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Richard Howard and I'm Aurora's Global Research Director. In this episode, we'll be focusing on the energy transition predominantly in Europe. We want to focus on the electrification of everything, the growth of renewables, but particularly what that means in terms of the need for flexibility and backup solutions to keep the lights on. I'm joined by Javier Cavada, President and CEO for the EMEA region for Mitsubishi Power, a role he's held since 2021. Javier has a background in industrial engineering. Before Mitsubishi, he was previously the President and CEO of Highview Power, and prior to that spent 17 years at Wärtsilä Corporation, eventually serving as President of the Energy Division and a member of the Executive Board. So he brings a wealth of experience on power technologies, their role in power systems. Welcome to the podcast, Javier.
Thank you, Richard. Big pleasure.
Thanks. And I'm also joined today by Dilara Caglayan, who's a lead expert for European hydrogen markets at Aurora. As I know that we'll probably talk quite a bit about hydrogen today, the role of hydrogen. So welcome to the podcast as well, Dilara.
Thank you, Richard.
Brilliant. I'll kick us off and sort of set the scene, hopefully to try and focus the discussion. So as I said, the jumping off point here for the podcast is that we often talk as a key pillar of decarbonisation about electrification, the kind of electrification of everything, or nearly everything, maybe everything that can be electrified. And if we look, to base that in some numbers, if we look globally, forecasts show that we might need to increase our power consumption roughly double from now until 2050. So to give exact numbers, we're at around 26,000 terawatt hours now, and we need to more or less double that to around 50,000 terawatt hours globally by 2050, which is like adding a major country like Japan every year between now and then. Narrowing down to Europe, as I want to talk about Europe quite a bit today, Aurora projects that power demand could increase at least 60%, potentially much more, by 2050. And the sorts of drivers of this, both in Europe but also around the world, especially the electrification of transport, which has low levels of electrification at the moment, a newer trend, but the rise of data centers, which are increasing power consumption very rapidly at the moment. And especially outside Europe, certain emerging markets see very, very fast increases in power consumption. So we know we're going to need a lot more electrons. And if we want to get to ambitious decarbonisation plans around the world, we're going to need a heck of a lot of clean electrons. And renewables are really forming the backbone of this, especially wind and solar. Again, to give some numbers, we're now deploying globally more than 100 gigawatts of wind, and in the last year, more than 500 gigawatts of solar. It's actually incredible. We recently passed the 2 terawatt mark for installed solar capacity in 2024, having only got to 1 terawatt in 2022. So again, in Europe, we see massive increases in renewable energy as part of this transition. But the most difficult part of this, in my mind, is not how to deploy those clean electrons in renewables, but actually how to still run the power system. And so what we're going to need alongside that massive growth of renewables and massive growth of power demand is huge amounts of flexibility in the system to balance those renewables and keep the lights on. And I'm hoping this, Javier, is where I can start to bring you in. So against that enormous set of challenges around decarbonisation and electrification, the growth of renewables, and particularly the need for flexibility, how do you at Mitsubishi respond to that set of challenges?
Amazing start, amazing introduction, Richard. Really, thank you. You are making it down the hill for me or for Mitsubishi. As you know well, I need to firstly highlight that we are a technology company. We're a technology group. We are the energy brand of the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Group that is having a history of over 160 years since the company started. So we are in multiple sectors, but energy is one of the largest businesses we have. And the company has been leading, pioneering solar in the 20th century, also started the offshore wind in the start of this 21st century. So we have been quite strong in battery cells and technology 10 years ago, and today we are moving into technologies like power generation using hydrogen, ammonia, capture of carbon, of CO2 emissions, sequestration, etc. So we have a huge palette of technologies. Again, we are a player that is looking how to bring the solutions that society is demanding. And you said it really well. You put a lot of numbers in your introduction. And I would like first is to complement with a bit of perspective. I mean, definitively we are implementing solar and wind like there is no end. So with a huge ambition and huge success. So I think that we need to be quite proud in the energy sector about the amount of clean energy, clean electricity production that we are bringing. But if you sum up the numbers that you were highlighting, we are still today in 2025, we are below 10% of the global power generation in terms of real electricity provided to the grid. We're a bit over 10% in terms of net or nominal capacity, but as we all know, wind is not operating 24 hours per day and solar is not operating 24 hours per day. So if you sum up everything in the current renewable revolution in which we are, and we are in Mitsubishi, we are the biggest proponents and supporters of more clean electricity everywhere and electrify everything that can be electrified. Still, we are on the verge of reaching 10% of the electricity globally being produced coming from 100% clean sources. So a long way forward to go. But that is only to decarbonize the electricity that we use today. So you talk about 60% growth in Europe in the coming 25 years, almost 100% growth globally. This requires an enormous uplift of capabilities, uplift of technology. So you named flexibility. So what we need is power that is supporting more wind and more solar to be utilized, power that is decarbonized, and power that is able to be all the time running. Data storage, artificial intelligence, processes that are critical like foundries, hospitals, different means of development and means of high quality life require firm power, require power that is all the time running. So you cannot rely on the clouds, you cannot rely on only natural sources. So that's why we see that we have an enormous challenge as humankind, as society, and we are putting all the capabilities of our group, of the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Group and of Mitsubishi Power, all invested into how to decarbonize the existing sources of electricity that can enable more wind, more solar into the grid, and can enable a much bigger utilization of electricity, utilization of power, because we have as a society already decided that we need more energy and we need this energy to be clean. So welcome to a new revolution in which we are already embedded. So.
No, thanks, Javier. That really builds on what I was saying. I mean, just to be really clear for listeners, and so everyone understands the growth story of your company, just sort of playing back what you said, the broader company, Mitsubishi Heavy Industry, has been involved, as you say, in renewables, as a pioneer in solar and in wind. That's not your focus of your group, specifically. That's more on thermal power assets and storage. Maybe if you could just say a little bit more about how your group with your unit fits within that broader and huge group.
Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, so I mentioned that we are 100, or the company is 160 years old today, or 160 years young, as you want to call it. The only way to succeed in that age is to adapt and to convert yourself and to develop and evolve yourself into the technologies that the society or the planet or the people are needing in the different decades and the different years. So that's why the company started in solar in the 1980s, and when when the solar started to become more mature and started to require volumes of production, then the company gave these licenses or provided these licenses to the manufacturers, and well, the solar market started to bang and to boom 20 years ago due to the volumes and the scale of manufacturing, mostly in China. So we, less than 15 years ago, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, together with Vestas, was the largest offshore wind player globally, and we have seen that we have done our contribution as a technology company, and we are passing that technology through, handing it over to our partners, and so we continue being involved. But you said it very wisely. I mean, so today our two main pillars of a strategy are very related to electricity generation using molecules. So how to take the gas, the methane molecule as the transition fuel, and how to decarbonize it, replacing it with green hydrogen and replacing it with other molecules like green ammonia, and being able to provide firm electricity that can back up and can support the wind and solar deployments. And the other pillar that we have in the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries group is the carbon value chain. How to capture the CO2 emissions from sectors that cannot fully decarbonize more than by capturing them and stopping them at the source, and how to create a value mechanism that the CO2 molecule can have an additional new value. For instance, sustainable fuels for aviation, for shipping, etc. So that makes us a player that has all the know-how of the technologies that are valid and relevant today and tomorrow. But we are focusing all our efforts where we see that the Mitsubishi Power capabilities will make the biggest contribution, which is how to make the firm power, so from molecule to electricity, to enable that growth of power production and that decarbonization of the power production. So in a nutshell, we have been in all the technologies, and today we are developing new technologies that we are not mentioning today, like production of hydrogen with different mechanical, chemical, and industrial processes, to find new ways to reduce the cost and to democratize the production of hydrogen for the whole planet. And this will take us, for sure, not to be fully focused on production of hydrogen, but to handle this technology to our partners, because it's something that we have learned along the decades, Richard, is that this is not a game in which one company can make it all. So you need to get alliances, you're going to get strong people around you, and once somebody is stronger than you, let them run and give them all the means and all the capabilities. And that's, I have to say, our company, besides having over 90,000 engineers, has a very clear vision of contributing to the development and to the improvement of the life of our people in the planet.
No, it's a very powerful story. I mean, also a really interesting one from a business perspective of how your company strategy has evolved with all these things happening around you. To keep on, if I can summarize what you've done is, as technologies have reached maturity, you've been part of that process, but you've then thought maybe others are better to mass produce, and you move on to the next challenge. And it seems like you do that again now, focusing on the cleaner molecules and the carbon value chain. So maybe let's dive into one of those, and I'm keen to focus especially on the hydrogen side as we have Dilara here today. And what I want to do is maybe get perspectives from both of you. I'll come to Dilara first and then back to yourself, Javier, on sort of how we think hydrogen fits into the global energy system and its long-term potential. So Dilara, I suppose we've been working on hydrogen for a while here at Aurora, both together, and we started 2019, 2020, getting really excited about it alongside a lot of others. In fact, excitement was very much the word. There was excitement led to hype, and then hype has led back to reality, maybe in the last year or so. Could you take us, add a bit more to the story that I've just told, Dilara, of how perceptions about hydrogen use have evolved over the last few years, and especially with a focus on Europe and a lot of the work you've done. Can you tell us a bit more of that story, and also what are the implications now as the reality sets in about what a more likely role is for hydrogen in Europe?
That's a very good question, Richard. Taking a step back and calling out a few words and timelines you have mentioned already. A few years ago, the hype or the excitement has started with the idea of hydrogen being one of the silver bullets that could help us with our decarbonization efforts. A lot of national hydrogen strategies have been published, very ambitious targets, got a lot more ambitious later even. But now we are seeing the market cooling down and getting into the realism phase. What are the factors affecting that? So first of all, I think one of the most challenging bits about the hydrogen market was the misconception of hydrogen costs being at around 1-2 euros per kilogram. That was one of the very first projects that we worked at Aurora. We tried finding solutions to reach those cost figures. It was not possible. And we were right about it. So market also has realized that the costs are a lot higher than expected. And this has created and shifted the perception of hydrogen a little bit from the silver bullet to more of a champagne of the decarbonization. Those are the buzzwords. But it explains how the role is evolving. What hydrogen was considered to play a role in like every single component, every single sector in these decarbonization efforts has changed into a targeted approach in the past years, especially in the 2024-5 timeline, where we are focusing more on the industrial applications, decarbonizing those ones, or hard to abate sectors, or in certain cases, some applications where it's inevitable to use, such as power to X in certain countries, which I'm pretty sure we're going to touch on in the coming minutes. But while the challenges persist, one very good thing that happened in the market is the support and the clarity. Most of the risks and uncertainties around the hydrogen market has also been resolved. Of course, we have a longer way to go, but we have started hearing more and more public support. We have started hearing more and more projects taking final investment decisions, investing real money on these projects, and some of them are even coming online now. And those are all happening since the last year, which is very exciting.
So in a sense, there has been a slowdown, there has been a cool down from the hype, but what we are now seeing as well is the rubber hitting the road and some real projects coming through. Okay, they might not reach the ambitious cost numbers that were once bandied around that we never believed, but they are, with some support from governments, stuff is happening. I was actually reflecting, I think we both were, on the European Hydrogen Bank auctions for production, the production side. Actually, the subsidies there are not huge. They're pretty small. So if some projects can get away at that level, there is hope. And so it's not that there's no hope. There is hope and there is potential. But as you say, it's more narrowly defined around industrial decarbonisation. Javier, would you agree with that? Like, where do you see the most attractive parts of the hydrogen value chain, and what are the key opportunities that you're looking at as a company?
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think Dilara's explanation has been spot on, and I really appreciate it very much. I will use a bit the advantage of age in this industry. I mean, I'm over 20 years in this business, over 20 years. And let me make a comment on this last week. I mean, probably you know that I'm living in London, and for somebody with this accent, the weather here in London is quite tough. Sometimes it's a bit cold, and I remember we were discussing, this is the coldest winter I remember. And somebody, a wiser person here in the office, told me, yeah, this is the coldest winter since last winter. I mean, so that was quite a funny one. And why I say that? Because indeed, 20 years ago, I was in gas to power industry, and we saw the solar technology as a really high cost solution that had a lot of advantages, but it was not feasible at all to be deployed at a scale. I mean, and I'm talking about 2004, 2005, 2006. So in the industry, it was seen as a I will not call it the champagne in the case of the solar, but it was like platinum-plated windows for your houses. So it was totally unaffordable. So 10 years later, even 5 years later to the years I mentioned, the cost of solar PV reduced over 90%. So we became less than 1/10 and became less than 1/20 pretty quickly by economies of scale. So I would not say it was exactly the same, but not very far. It happened with wind 15 years ago. So wind was, okay, the wind is wonderful, but it's never going to be feasible. It's too expensive. The units are too unreliable and too intermittent. Well, today we see that wind is one of the most reliable and most solid sources of electricity in places like the UK and all the western and northern part of Europe. And we have seen as companies and in organizations that have multi-decades perspective, if you start to pause and analyze, you see that we are not in a two different situation with hydrogen into the power sector. So we also see that hydrogen is way more expensive than gas, and it's not going to be possible to get competitive with gas. The same as solar was never going to be competitive with gas or with other solutions. And what is going to be needed to change that situation as it happened before? Exactly what Dilara was mentioning, that projects start to happen at a scale, that projects start to show that the cost, the scale is helping all these projects to show better figures than what it was 1 year before. Every year we see that all the costs are going down as we deploy more. So we are talking about molecules that have huge energy density. So we are talking exactly the opposite to things like battery cells. Battery cells, you need a huge volume of kilowatt hours to deploy big scale or big volumes of electricity or energy. In the molecules, you need only small increments to have exponential increments in the output that you are getting. So the bigger the project are, the bigger the projects become, the biggest advantage and the biggest learning and the biggest learning curves we're going to get into. So in that sense, I'm quite optimistic. I think that the fact that the rubber hit the ground and that we became pragmatic, we are in an era, we are in the 2020s where everything is very fast. I think the hype of hydrogen started only a couple of years ago and 1 year ago died. So it's one of those very short cycles, if you allow me. Simply, it was indeed, as Dilara mentioned, thought or perceived or stated by some people that hydrogen was that bullet, that silver bullet that was resolving everything. Absolutely wrong. I mean, it's indeed we need all the technologies that can scale up and can become contributor to decarbonisation are going to be fundamental. So from solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, molecules to power, everything that is possible to deploy at scale and at speed is going to be fundamental. And hydrogen, the same as solar before, the same as gas 30, 40 years ago, when gas was replacing fuel, or now that gas is replacing coal, you need a scale. You need a scale. And I mentioned before that hydrogen, we see, and as Mitsubishi Power, we see hydrogen as the molecule that will decarbonize the electricity in the future. Will not be the solution to everything, but will be the key that opens the door for wind and solar to become massive, because you will need wind and solar electricity to produce hydrogen. You will use all those excesses or those capabilities of renewables to produce your zero carbon hydrogen, and hydrogen will replace the carbon molecules or the fossil fuel molecules in the existing infrastructure. So let's not forget that we have already a total system globally, especially in Europe and the Western world, but of course in Japan and China, Middle East, etc., that is running on fossil fuels. And we need to decarbonize it quickly. So unfortunately, we cannot just shut it down and build a totally 100% renewable driven system. First, because of the cost. Second, because of the time. And to accelerate the decarbonization demand and mission that we have, we need to focus on decarbonizing that system, which means add more wind, add more solar, and decarbonize all the other sources of electricity you have. For instance, coal has to be replaced by gas. Gas needs to be slowly, step by step, replaced by cleaner molecules. And that's so in that sense, it's very good that those who were talking about the champagne and the silver bullet, that just stay aside, let the reality be on the headlines, and give everybody that sense of urgency that I'm sure that Dilara is very happy about, because when you become pragmatic, you can run. If you run not being pragmatic, you go nowhere.
No, it's an optimistic perspective. I want to challenge you a bit, Javier, because
Please.
I feel a bit like, you talk about the story of solar and wind and the incredible cost declines we've seen, especially on solar. You could say the same thing about battery technologies, but I question a bit more whether we'll see that rapid declining cost for hydrogen technologies. So let me say why, but then let's think about where hydrogen sits against the spectrum of other options. So I suppose the thing with solar is mass production and huge economies of scale have just led to just an insane fall in cost, like again and again and again, defying expectations. That the cost of the cell modules have fallen and fallen. The thing with hydrogen, if we think of the full value chain, if we started with some electrons, some hopefully clean electrons, through an electrolyzer, we made some hydrogen, there were some efficiency losses, then we've got some hydrogen, we put it through a fuel cell or a turbine, and then we've got some power again. If that was the play, the challenge I see is, even if those unit costs of those units fell dramatically, the levelized cost of that hydrogen produced is not all about the equipment. It's also the electricity and those inherent efficiency losses. So there's only so much cost you can drive out of that side. And on the conversion back from hydrogen to power, physics, laws of physics and thermodynamics and things that you'll know more about than I do, being an engineer, mean that you can't defy those laws, and there will be, therefore, costs. So there's a bit of a challenge, not a new one, not the first time people will have thrown that at you. So hydrogen is one option. Power to X to power, that's one thing we could do. That sits alongside CCS in your portfolio. That sits alongside batteries in your portfolio. That's just within your company and within a system. How do you think those technologies will play out? Which do you see as the biggest potential? You're a company active in all those things. What's your vision of how they sit together, and which one wins, or will they just coexist?
Thank you. Definitely is the latter. I will, of course, address your challenge, because you see from my smile that I love it. It's absolutely. I want to highlight something I'm sure that you know very well, but from out of all the technologies that we have connected to the grid globally, the one that is the lowest efficiency by far is the solar PV. So it's 1-digit percentage efficiency from photon to electron. So is allow me to, as a mechanical engineer, I would say ridiculous. But of course, the economies of scale of manufacturing have made it feasible and have made it affordable, to the point that installing windows made of glass are becoming more expensive than installing a solar panel in your facade. So which is talking about the supply chain and the globalization phenomenon that we have experienced in the last 20 years. An additional point is that you in Aurora know this better than I do, is that the wind and solar electricity, the wind and solar installation, the wind and solar projects that are being coming into line are being, allow me to be quite brutal here, are being dramatically curtailed. So it's today, in the UK, that is not a windy day, I have to say today. The more wind we implement into the grid, the more percentage of wind is being shut down, because the grid is not able to absorb it. So you don't only have the lack of wind during long periods along the year and along the days, but you also have many moments in which the demand of electricity does not match the production or the generation made with wind. So there it comes. Places like the US is already happening for a few years, where your electricity production becomes price negative. So you are being paid, or many companies are being paid to absorb the electricity that, if you are not taking it, would be totally wasted. It's happening the same with solar in multiple parts of the world, but California was in the news recently. Valencia in Spain was in the news recently, Spain, Italy, Portugal, many places. Hydro, the same thing. So hydro, you need to pump water, and sometimes you need to curtail your water or let the turbines open and let the water go down because you need still to be filling up your dam. So where am I going? That the logic of the system cannot be studied one by one, technology by technology. I am going to look at solar, I'm going to look at wind, I'm going to look at batteries. You need to have a system perspective. And then you have a lot of wasted solar, more and more the more you install. You have a lot of wasted wind, more and more the more you install. Batteries, I want to highlight, being in batteries for many years, that 8 years ago, they were telling to me, 8 years, not a long time ago, in 2016, that battery could never have the same learning curve as wind and solar, so because it's a totally different balance on plant, a lot of, well, it's I have to say, thanks to the planet, thanks God, and thanks to the engineers, and thanks to the financiers, it happened. So the curves are going down. I believe we got a reduction close to 50% in the last 2 years. It's quite dramatic post-COVID, the cost reduction, and that's dramatic positively. And when you look at hydrogen, the law of physics is 100% with you. You cannot change that, but the way you produce the equipment that separates the hydrogen from the oxygen and creates the hydrogen molecule or makes it green, definitely allow me to be a production engineer again, that it's all about scale, it's all about volume. And if today the largest project making green hydrogen for electricity in the planet is being constructed in Utah, in the States, is 300 megawatt electrolyzers, manufactured electrolyzers in Norway, so it's a low-cost country. No, sorry, it's a European country. That is the state of the art. So the state of the art. I mean, Mitsubishi is the developer. Mitsubishi Power is the one implementing that project, which has gas-fire combined cycle that is going to be utilizing blended hydrogen with the intention of fully do only hydrogen. Has a huge salt cavern underground to store the hydrogen being produced. But I wanted to use that project as an example. This is the largest project worldwide ever. I hope it will be the second largest and the third largest soon, which means that the projects that Dilara was mentioning are materializing at the speed, because that will show the speed, the scale, the volume. And well, we will be talking, Richard, I am sure that before 2028, we will be talking about, it's happening. It's happening.
No, I hope so. So I'm kind of got an eye on the clock, and we'll bring this to a close soon. But before we do, we talk about kind of Europe as a whole so far in this debate. I want to narrow it a little bit to try and understand from both of you, actually. Maybe if I go to Dilara first and then Javier. Which do we see as the most attractive geographical markets for hydrogen? So if you try and get under the skin of Europe as a whole, which markets are giving enough certainty to investors? Where are we seeing these projects actually pulling through and becoming a reality, and kind of where not? So maybe Dilara, if you could comment, and then Javier, where do you see the potential?
Last year was a key year, and because of that, I'm going to use this in my answer. There were a lot of projects taking the investment decisions. There were a lot of projects getting support from auctions like EHB or Danish auctions and so on and so forth. When you look at the overall market, a hydrogen market emerging, I would say Germany and Great Britain are the front runners because they have massive amount of support available for hydrogen from supply to the off-taker in their own ways, different ways, but they're looking at it from a total market perspective. But if you were to break it down to where can I produce my hydrogen cheaply? Because we have talked a lot about cost. It's one of the main concerns of this market. It's one of the issues of this market. Then you need to look at countries where you could have cheap electricity and availability of this electricity. And you would see more of countries like Nordics, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, or Iberia, where you have abundant amounts of solar and wind available. Those regions would be great for producing, But when you look at off-takers and the infrastructure developments, I would still get back to my initial answer and say GB and Germany.
Would you agree, Javier?
100%, Dilara. You made it. You made exactly the places that I was gonna say. Definitely the UK due to wind and the government support, and Germany due to the government support. Of course, you said it very well. The Nordics and Spain and Portugal as the production places together. Of course, beyond Europe, the northern part of Africa, so Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, that are, as you know, same distance and with pipelines of gas already available. So in that sense, as we see that it is happening, but definitely without government decision is the rules. You can be an amazing footballer, but if the referee is not letting you, it's not letting you. So nice.
Very good. A great answer. I'm going to wrap us up now. We could be chatting all day, probably for several hours, but people might stop listening to that podcast at some point. I often end the podcast by surprising the interviewee with some questions on things. And the structure here is over or underrated. I'm going to talk about some different things. You can just tell me, Javier, do you think they're over or underrated in the debate? So first one, there's a lot of talk about a renaissance of nuclear, including SMRs and other forms of nuclear. Do you think that's over or underrated?
I think due to time, I think it's overrated.
Okay. What about geothermal? Again, lots of people suddenly talking about, well, maybe it's actually quite niche. There's a lot of enthusiasts about geothermal out there and they talk about it. There's some potential.
Allow me to give a data point, Richard. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Mitsubishi Power were #1 market share globally in geothermal, which gives me a bit of a hint of the size of the market today. It's not big. It's not big, as you know. Is of course Iceland is the mecca in Europe for that, and Africa we have plenty of places. It's definitively a technology that makes a lot of sense. It's lacking the intermittency, so it's difficult to, in European regulation perspective, is not feasible to find geothermal the same as fracking or the same as other landscape affecting technologies. So it's not going to be possible. But the Canary Islands, Iceland, good places, and as I mentioned, Africa as a whole continent is full of potential.
So probably underrated overall, but in very specific places.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, good summary. And finally, I think I might know which way you'll go on this, but DACS, direct air carbon capture and storage. Do you think it's over or underrated?
I tell you again, everything is so dependent. Is technology-wise, is an amazing technology, but I have to say it's the only way forward for industries that have no other chance. Cement, steel. I mean, we cannot produce renewables, bring development, bring data centers, bring robots without the steel, cement, and aluminium, and all those sectors require carbon capture. I mean, you cannot fully decarbonize those systems without. So that's why carbon capture is going to be large but niche at the same time.
Yeah, and again, another cost challenge there on DACS, especially to get those costs down for it.
Absolutely. And if you allow me, the volume challenge is bigger. It's a much bigger challenge in that sense.
Yeah. Well, Javier, it's been fascinating talking to you. Clearly very knowledgeable and experienced on these topics. So it's been fascinating talking to you. We could talk for hours. Maybe we'll follow up another time. But thanks so much for joining the podcast. Also, thanks, Dilara, for joining us as well. We'll end there.
Let's do so. Thank you, Dilara, and thank you, Richard.
Thank you both.
That was Javier Cavada, President and CEO for the EMEA region for Mitsubishi Power, talking to Richard Howard, Aurora's Global Research Director, and Dilara Caglayan, Lead Expert for European Hydrogen Markets at Aurora. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.